Welcome to Politics in the Pub. Thank you for your modest attendance. Look, on your behalf, let me acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Let's acknowledge and express our gratitude for their stewardship of the land, past and present, and with regard to the appalling environmental policies of the present government, their stewardship for the future. Tonight's topic is also, that tribute to Indigenous people is apt, because tonight's topic is also about the predicament and the conditions of highly vulnerable people. The barbarism of the bipartisan Australian policies regarding the treatment of refugees. And it's pretty obvious from your attendance that we have probably two of the best box office draw speakers on this important topic. Julian Burnside QC is one of the greatest barristers in this country. Most of his practices in commercial litigation, trade practices and administrative law, but we know him, and I may say love him, for his standing up for justice and for human rights for asylum seekers and refugees, and that's why he's here. And that's why he's come up from Melbourne to be an important part of this public forum. And my old mate Phil Glendenning, with whom I feel I've spent a lot of time in jail, and we enjoyed one another's company in the exercise yard. Phil is the director of the Edmund Research Centre. He's been the director since its inception in 1996. He's the president of the Australian Refugee Council at the present time. He was one of the co-founders of ANTAR, Australians for Native Title and Reconciliation. I want you to, the format for tonight, for the next hour and a half, is that Julian and Phil will each have 20 minutes at the microphone, in which you will have a chance to craft questions in the second half. When they finish speaking, there'll be a 10-minute interval. It may have to be 11 minutes in order to get to the bar to replenish your thirst, in which we'll take a collection to keep this important public forum going. And then the second half is really about the Q&A session, because we desperately need questions that are going to help us craft an alternative policy to the cruelty that Australia promotes as refugee policy at the present time. Please welcome to the microphone Phil Glendenning.
Well, thank you very much, Stuart, and I'd like to thank you for coming out in such paltry numbers. So that this is going to put a big dent in the restaurant successes on television tonight, I can tell. But I'd like to also acknowledge the Gadigal people of the great Eora Nation. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. And if anybody had a problem with the arrival of unauthorised people to this country, it was the Gadigal people of the great Eora Nation in 1788. And I think there's a link there, between the first peoples and the last to arrive. Like people come to this country by boat, and we've seen the sort of meltdown that happens. People come to this country by plane to seek asylum. Last year, up to October, 14,000 people came, and you don't hear Alan Jones screaming, "Stop the planes." You don't hear Tony Abbott, "Tow back the planes, shut down Sydney Airport." So there's something about us and boats. And I agree that particularly this bipartisan barbarism is not actually an extreme title to put on tonight's proceedings. I find the treatment of asylum seekers and refugees in this country to be shameful. And 20 or 30 years from now, a Prime Minister will rise in the Parliament, and maybe before then, who will utter an apology on behalf of the nation to particularly the children of asylum seekers and their families for the damage and harm that's been done to them today. And all of us will rejoice. Kids will come into the halls of their schools to watch the apology live on television. Church groups will formulate prayers to pray about it on the weekend, how fantastic it is the country's done this. But we don't need them then, we need them now. And obviously people like yourselves, you are here for that reason. Last year I was given a poem by an Iranian asylum seeker young bloke, 24-year-old. And I've learnt this thing off by heart, and I'd like to commence with it tonight. Because if there's one thing that's been missing in this whole diatribe and bipartisan barbarism, it's any sense of human dignity. You know, it was the notion that the Kantian injunction is that human beings are not a means to an end. They are an end in and of themselves. That's been forgotten here. This notion, oh, we've got to be cruel to be kind. Well, that's not in any way, shape or form true. It's just cruel and it's got to stop. So this asylum seeker who was locked up in an Australian detention centre wrote this down. It's a reworking of an ancient Iranian poem. He says, look, I don't know what will happen when I die. I don't want to know. But I'd like the potter to make a whistle from the clay of my throat, and for that whistle to fall into the hands of a naughty child, and for that child to blow on that whistle with all the silent and suppressed air of his lungs, so it may disturb the sleep of those who are dead to my cries. Wow. Now I think the moral and political failure we are witnessing in Australia today is often because our politicians assume that we are dead to the cries of people like that. Now we're not, because we're all here tonight. And you remember that famous quote on Four Corners last year, or just before the last election, when the new member for Lindsay went on the television and said, the reason we don't like asylum seekers and refugees out here is because our traffic's so bad. So I got on the phone to Paul Power at the Refugee Council and said, mate, how many refugees and asylum seekers are living in Lindsay? He said, give me an hour. He rings back. Do you know how many? 23. I said, how many have access to a car? He said, give me an hour. Well, we didn't get all 23, but we think we can come across one that was actually in charge of a motor vehicle. So whether this is xenophobia or whether this is racism, what it is a very ugly part of Australian-ness that's being played to some of our citizens, and it's been proven to be successful. Now I contrast that with going to Geneva a couple of times a year to represent the Refugee Council and to see the way the rest of the world is reacting. And I want to focus tonight a little bit on the work that I'm most closely involved with regards to returnees, particularly to Afghanistan and Sri Lanka, and to contrast that with what the rest of the world is doing. Because if there's any hope to be derived from out of this tonight, it is that the rest of the world is fairly abhorred by what we are doing. You know, when the Foreign Minister of Pakistan stands up in the United Nations and says, we have 3 million refugees from Afghanistan in our country, we would like for them to be able to go home peacefully. But we're not going to force them back because it's not safe to do so. The place bursts into applause. When the Foreign Minister of Iran, that well-known bastion of human rights on earth, the Mullas of Iran, get up and say, we've got over 1.7 million refugees from Afghanistan in Iran. Our preferred option is for them to go home when it's safe, but it's not safe to do so. We're not going to send them back. We have, in February of this year, the Minister for Refugees and Repatriation in Afghanistan, Mr. Hossein Balki, gets up and in interviews across the world says 3 things. It's unreasonable to expect Kabul to be able to receive all those who are forcibly returned, especially when they're from other provinces. 2, the security situation in Afghanistan is not stable, with 80% of the country unsafe. And he called upon all European governments and the Australian government to suspend deportation. Don't forcibly return people to Afghanistan. The Europeans have done that. Last night, Australia confirmed that we had deported a young man back to Kabul. No one else is doing this. If the Pakistanis don't do it, the Iranians don't do it, but somehow we are doing it. Now, over the course of the last few years, we have sent people back, despite the fact that we know in September of last year, an Australian citizen was taken off the bus on the road between Kabul and Johori and murdered by the Taliban. We know that Zainullah Nasseri was deported back on the 16th of August last year and was told that he'd be perfectly safe in Kabul. We got there and found that wasn't the case, so we tried to get down to Ghazni, his home province. That road is owned by the Taliban. And of course, he was kidnapped and tortured, managed to escape after a couple of days, and got back to Kabul. He's now on the run somewhere there. Now, these are classic examples of refoulement. In the first 6 months of this year in Afghanistan, the UN has documented a record number of 4,921 civilian casualties, over 1,500 deaths, 3,500 injured, which is an average of 9 civilians being killed and 18 wounded every day. The female casualties have soared by 23% and children by 13%. Between January and August of this year, we've got 1,523 civilian casualties from suicide bombs. I've got a big picture on my wall. I've only got a black and white image of it here. And if you want, I'll make it available to people. It's of a bomb going off in Quetta. Now, Quetta is on the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan. It's where the Hazara people have to go in order to register to become an asylum seeker. Because you cannot seek asylum in your own country. You've got to leave your country before you can seek asylum. So they go to Quetta. And over the course of the last number of years, there have been a series of bomb attacks in Quetta. On this day in 2011, 178 people were killed. But up behind the square, as they're picking up and taking away the wounded, there's a big sign, a big billboard. One of those boats we see off Christmas Island. And the words written in Dari next to it say, "Don't risk your life going to Australia by boat." And I showed that to a doctor who was working for an NGO. I said, "Mate, what's your response to that?" He said, "It makes me laugh." And we wander out to his village, and it's deserted. Deserted. He points up on the hill, from here up to Glue Point Road. And there's a sandbag gun turret. He says, "Oh, that's the Taliban's new base." He says, "I'm on the death list because I've been associating with Westerners. What should I do?" Get out. You see, we are in the blessed and cursed position of not knowing what war smells like, what it feels like, what the fear that gets into your heart and your gut when you think, "I drop my kids to school each day and I don't know what it's going to be like when I go home in the afternoon, if they'll be alive." End quote. And we're sending people back to that who quite clearly, I believe, have got valid claims. Clearly. What does that tell us about us at this point in time? And we've had an increased attack on Hazaras right across the country, and I'd refer you to the work of Professor William Maley from the ANU, who's got this stuff very well and clearly documented. And then we turned to Sri Lanka. And people said to me, Frank Kelly said to me, "I think things are really improving there because, there's a change of leadership." Well, that's true. There's been a change of leadership and things are improving politically. But the people who run the CID and the secret police are the same people. And so we've sent 2,000 people back to Sri Lanka since 2012 with dire consequences for some of those people. 30 that were returned back recently managed to escape to Nepal. And two of those families, about 12 people, were found within a month by the UNHCR to be valid refugees and were given immediate registration as refugees and put in place for resettlement somewhere around the world. It took the Nepalese and UNHCR less than a month to determine these people were valid refugees. We turned them around at sea. This is so-called enhanced screening. This notion that we can move people quickly through and send them back. We know for a fact also that Australia's been aiding and abetting the Sri Lankan regime. You've heard about the gunboat, providing the gunboats that enable the Sri Lankan Navy to better stop the boats. Well, it actually hasn't done that. So we sort of think if boats are still able to get out of Sri Lanka, it's got to be with the acquiescence of the Sri Lankan Navy and the police, frankly. Australia's also provided, as was documented by the 7:30 report the other night, has been providing equipment like a white van. Now, the white van's a terribly powerful symbol in Sri Lanka. Why are we doing this when the British and the Europeans and the United States are doing the opposite? Again, what does this say about us? We've tracked ourselves at the Edmund Centre 4 people recently who were sent back to Sri Lanka and who were arrested and tortured. Human Rights Watch have reported 10 cases of rape, torture and inhuman and degrading treatment of returnees in Sri Lanka, and even the Australian newspapers reported stories of the torture of 3 returnees. Now this doesn't much make the press, because you might get a shot on Lateline, you might get a 10-minute grab with Radio National. But it seems to me that if the Pakistanis are able to get this thing right, the Iranians are able to understand what's going on, we have a challenge in this country to make people really get their heads around what's happening in that part of the world. But coming back closer to home, what have we learned lately? So yes, we've been refueling people to Sri Lanka, to Afghanistan. 4 of those people that went back to Vietnam were arrested at the airport and are still being held, allegedly tortured by people in the Vietnamese community here. We've heard that we have been paying people smugglers to return asylum seekers, confirmed by Jim Molan the other day on the ABC. As we sit here tonight, we've got some 213 children in indefinite detention continuing in detention centres here and on Nauru. And then there's Saskatoon. There's a 17-year-old boy on Nauru and his father who fled from ISIS in Syria, got to Christmas Island and were taken to Nauru. Told their story and very quickly were found to actually be, yes, you have valid claims, you're a refugee, and given protection in the community in Nauru. Unbeknownst to them, 5 other smaller siblings and his wife were picked up by the Canadians out of Damascus and were taken straight to Saskatoon and were provided with, yes, you are a refugee, yes, you are entitled to a reunion with your son and your husband, and we issued the visas in Canada on the 2nd of August last year, 2nd of December last year, with a 1-year caveat for the offer to be taken up for the reunion to happen. They still haven't been able to get off Nauru. And they are valid refugees. So you talk about barbarism. The Australians deny knowledge, the Nauruans deny knowledge, the Canadians are trying to find out what's going on. But we've got it's almost like a little picture of what's gone wrong here. And it's a mantra since we set up Operation Sovereign Borders, since we militarised what is a humanitarian crisis globally. And it's a mantra that says, oh, no crack of light. So we're not going to take anyone from Indonesia to resettle them. We're going to send people back to Indonesia. Even though we know that, for example, 2 women, 7 months and 8 months pregnant, ended up in the Bali detention centre, where we were contacted by a Christian group that was working with them to say their story was that they were pushed back in one of those red lifeboats, buckets, sent back to Indonesia, stopped for 3 nights on a deserted island because they just landed somewhere and were fortunate enough for a fishing boat to come past and pick them up. That's our taxes at work. And you'll hear politicians in the Labor Party say, oh mate, we've got to turn them around to stop them coming. Well, that's a bit like taking a child who can't swim and throwing him in the ocean in the hope that to stop someone else from drowning. Or to say to this kid, oh, we're going to stop you from... It's ridiculous. You know, you hear politicians saying we have to, I saw a child die on my watch. So we're going to put more kids' lives at risk by pushing them further back to sea. Everyone from the Pope through the United Nations to the bloke who owns the pet shop down here in Glebe knows that that's wrong. It's in breach of the law. It's morally wrong. It's in breach of every international obligation we have signed up to, and yet it rolls on and rolls away. The notion that we can have cruelty as part of our public life, I put it to you frankly, is something that we have to find ways around when there are alternatives available to us. And, frankly, this notion about stopping boats, I agree. You don't want people to die at sea, but let's listen, folks. Since the 15th century, according to Patrick Dodson, boats have been coming to this country. You know what? We live in an island. My mate Brian Dorr said to me recently, mate, we wouldn't have to do this. Julian, we wouldn't have to do it if the country just had a bloody moat. Let's imagine for a moment, close your eyes everybody, close your eyes. Let's imagine Australia is an island surrounded by water. So yes, we don't want to see people die at sea. Of course we don't. And there are ways in which we could improve on that, because if you look at the cost, which most punters in this country aren't aware of, the cost of this thing. The United Nations most years struggles to raise $3 billion to look after 60 million refugees around the world and over 11 million people in camps. Australia, over the course of the last 3 or 4 years, has been spending well in advance of that. Some years well in advance of $4 billion. And Malcolm Fraser said to me last year, before sadly we lost him, he said, if you actually throw in the military cost, you can double it. Isn't that right, Julian? You can double it. So here we are spending up to close to 3 times the amount that the United Nations spends globally to do what? To torment and scare people. And they'll say, oh yeah, we've got to do it because we've stopped the boats. No, you haven't. If you listen to the United Nations High Commission Refugees at the Tripartite Conference recently in Geneva, they said there are more people at sea seeking refuge globally, and including in this region, than at any time since the Second World War. They've deflected boats from coming here. And it's a policy that basically says, look, go die somewhere else. Where our TV pictures can't see them, where we can turn over and watch a quiz show, and sort of, or I should say, turn over and watch a restaurant live sort of cooking show, have some guacamole with your conscience.
Very good, Phil.
But I put it to you, when we are reduced to that as a people, where compassion for people becomes a form of weakness rather than our greatest civilising strength, we've hit a point of national crisis. When members of the Labor Party say to us, we've got our turnbacks in the policy, mate, so we neutralise it. I said, well, that work well with Tampa. Big success there. We've learned from our history there. No, we have not learned from our history. And when you do that, you're bound to repeat the sins of it, and that's where we are now. So consequently, you know, there are alternatives here. Are we going for time sheet? Okay, there are alternatives. We at the Refugee Council have put up a 10-point plan we believe goes some way to acknowledging the fact that we do live on an island and people arrive and we've got to look after them. But before they get in a boat is the time that you need to act. Now internationally there's a realisation of that. I was in Britain during the election campaign recently, and in a debate, Nigel Farage, who's not known for his great support for immigration and human rights necessarily, the head of the UKIP party there, was asked the question, you know, why don't you advocate what the Australians are doing? You know, tow back boats, pull back boats, push them back. And he said, well, that might work for the Australians, but we here in England don't have the stomach for some of the things that they do. And you know, on the other scale, David Miliband, head of the Labor Party, says, well, look, Australia's in the fortunate position that when they tow people back to Indonesia, the Indonesians don't shoot them. You know, we're pulling people back to Indonesia who are not Indonesian. You know, people who land back in Indonesia have no legal claim to be there. What do refugees want on the journey through? They want legality of status, and they want safety and security. If that could be provided within the region, as well as acknowledging that people will come here by boat and will need to be processed here. But if you could do that in the region, where people could have access to education, they could have access to healthcare, their kids could go to school and they could work. History has told us post-Vietnam that people don't get in boats. Now, and I'm caveating that basically that's not just enough to say we're going to stop them. No, we have obligations for people who come. We have obligations to, obviously, at a time of global movement of people, to increase our intake. You know, that pinko crypto socialist Robert Menzies and his gang, you know, in 1 year, 49-50, took in over 87,000 refugees. Malcolm Fraser, at the height of the Vietnam crisis, in 1 year took in over 36,000. We've just halved it again, down to 13,750, and we will struggle to make that quota. You know, this notion that those who are sitting in camps knock out those who arrive by boat or vice versa is a myth that was created by John Howe, and the country's still paying for it. So there are other solutions. If our resources could be used cooperatively within the region, we've seen it happen after Vietnam, different circumstances, different people, but there are lessons there, what a future could look like. we could repair the relationship. The Europeans, when they are looking at what to do, are not saying, how do we stop people? They're still wrestling with how do we save people. The European Union is looking to do creative things before people get in boats. You know, even the Conservative British government has offered some horrible rhetoric, but they're still conceding that valid refugees have to be protected. We are pushing valid refugees back out to sea. You know, I've got a young, I'll finish on this note, I've got a young fella came to see me recently. He's a 20-year-old. He comes from Afghanistan. Came back from school one day to see that his brother, who had come from the university, had been taken in by the Taliban. They found that he had his student card in his pocket and they decapitated him. And they put his head on his chest out the front of this young bloke's house with a note to say, anybody in this village that goes to school, this is what will happen. His father was the doctor. So his father was running a clinic. He, on the road back into Kabul to pick up medicine, of course every medicine in Afghanistan is written in English writing, and he gets taken in by the Taliban. They have not seen him since. Then a note comes to say that if this young bloke doesn't come and join the Taliban, which is code for we'll kill you, then they will chase him and kill him. So his mother sits him down and she says to him, you're going to have to go. And I would rather not see you ever again and know you are alive than not ever see you again and know that you were dead. And that was the start of this young fella's journey. He's now 20. He's had 3 years in this country. We can't give him an answer as to whether or not he's a refugee. If you want a definition of bipartisan barbarism, ladies and gentlemen, that's it. The hope of the site is what the rest of the world is doing. From the Pope through to the European Union, to the Albanian government who just uplifted 800 people from Iraq, the first time they've taken in refugees. Why? Because we know what it's like to live under oppression. Niger and Mali keeping the border open because these people are our brothers and sisters. Lebanon has over a quarter of its population now as a refugee, not in camps, in the communities. And instead of having Operation Sovereign Borders, which I always thought sounds like something Bruce Willis should star in rather than a sensible policy, they've called for teachers so they can run double shifts. And every school's cost them 8% of their GDP, and every kid goes to school. There are alternatives out there. We need to find our voice collectively. You know, when Martin Luther King got up all those years ago, that he said, it's the silence that speaks the loudest, and we begin to die the day we are silent about the things that matter. This matters. These people matter. We can never be silent.